Hello and welcome. This panel discussion today is going to cover education. It's one of a series of discussions we've been doing on how different countries handle issues like education, welfare, taxes, domestic military involvement, and several other things. Our panel is being brought to you by the Department of History as well as the Department of Political Science and the American Democracy Project here at IPFW. The panelists today come from a variety of places around campus, and I'll start introducing over here to my left Sheena Choi from the College of Education and Public Policy, Sue-Ann Roberts from the Department of International Language and Culture Studies, also from ILCS, Farrah Combs, and then finally from the Department of History, Ann Livshiz. We want to thank you very much for tuning in, and we also want to thank CATV for recording these and making them available through CATV and the Helmke Library for putting them up on MDON. Not surprisingly, we like education. Everyone at this table is a fan of education, and so we should probably go ahead and make some sort of a blanket statement right away. Why is education important? And let's start with Ann.
Obviously, we can spend the entire hour talking about why education is important. I'll just mention a couple of things. Education is what helps people understand the world around them and make sense of the world around them. And so educated people can become better citizens, both of their respective country, but also increasingly of the world. At the same time, education is also something that helps people reach their potential. In today's society, in today's economy, education is not just a value in and of itself, but also something that helps people, do better in life.
Farrah?
I will start saying, I was brought up with this saying from Kuwait. The saying goes, Al-ilmu nur wal-jahlu dhalam, and what roughly translates to knowledge is light and ignorance is darkness. What the message it's sending, the saying is sending is, with knowledge you have power. And therefore, with education, it opens out a lot of doors for you that you wouldn't normally expect, and it expands the mind, and it expands the mind from darkness to illumination of the world around you.
Mm-hmm. Sue-Ann?
I can only agree with Ann and Farrah. Education for me is a path to leading a better life. And with that, I'm not talking about materialistic things, accumulating materialistic things, but rather the development of tolerance and understanding of the world, cultural awareness, maybe an interest in lifelong learning. Those are all the things that I think make education really important.
Mm-hmm. Sheena?
I think all of you said the very exact same thing I wanted to say. Fundamentally, I think education is improving quality of life. Recent years, there is a more emphasis on defining skills and getting a job. So it is a more emphasis on competitive edges in a labor market. But I think that the education is much more than that. It's through the knowledge people get empowered, and they can make a rational decision, more moral decision. And also they can have a better life, such as health, education lead to a healthier both physical and mental life, and also people can enjoy more cultural things, their own as well as other people's culture. So it just improve their quality of life beyond the getting a job and then and monetary returns from it.
And I do think that we had to make that disclaimer right at the front. Not surprisingly, we all are fans of education. In a lot of countries, young people are actually compelled to go to schools through some sort of formal education. And I want to know, has this always been the case? Ann, you're our resident historian today.
Well, and I'll focus primarily on the developments in Europe. Obviously, schools were not invented in the 19th century. You have schools in different forms around for quite some time. But what we do see happening in the 19th century is the introduction of state-provided elementary education in the basics, right? Reading, writing, arithmetic. And there are a number of factors that contribute to this. One is the growth of nationalism. And so state-sponsored schools were seen as places where common values could be inculcated into all children. There's some kind of common ground that everybody should be exposed to. This is a place where children will be socialized into in a variety of ways, including national traditions and culture. as a way to make sure that kind of regional differences are superseded by this greater national framework. There's also the sort of the recognition that as I know it sounds like such a contemporary thing to say, but as the economy becomes more advanced and grows, there's a recognition that a certain level of education is necessary for people to be productive members of society and contribute in a meaningful way. And so the development of the economy means that the state wanted more educated people. Now again, for now in the 19th century, we're not really talking sort of college, university, and so on. We're talking basic skills. But again, the sense that this is something that benefits, that this is something that benefits the country as a whole, and therefore something that needs to be invested in by the government. And then the last thing related to this is that development of the concept of childhood, right? I mean, again, it's one of those things that we take for granted as kind of having always been around, but the idea that childhood is a separate phase of life, that these are not just little adults, but a kind of a special group, is also relatively recent. And so the idea is that children are supposed to be doing something that only the children do, namely go to school. They're not supposed to be working; they're supposed to be going to school, and so the combination of these kind of broader patterns come together in the development of the state-provided, state-run schools. And so by the 20th century, it's a fairly widespread and common phenomenon in Europe, but there are a number of issues that need to be worked out. And this is something that we see happening over the course of the 20th century, some of these issues. For example, should boys and girls have the same kind of education? What should be the mandatory minimum schooling requirement, the number of years? What kinds of subjects? Do boys and girls study together, or do they study separately? All of these, and we see different political systems, different regimes answer these questions in a variety of ways over the course of the 20th century.
Sheena, you study Korea quite a bit. Is this what Anne said? Does this match what Korea's experience has been?
Similar, but it's the formal education, in a sense of compulsory education, is a recent phenomena. Korea historically emphasized the formal education, but it was mostly privileged groups. So even in recent years, since from early 1900 through 1945, when Korea became independent, this education was accessible to only upper class or a collaborator to Japanese colonial government. So there was so much hunger for this education. So as Korea became independent, there is people demanding for more education.
Mm-hmm. Farah, who actually ends up, in terms of compulsory education in Kuwait, who ends up going to school? Is it, as Sheena said, at one point in time in Korea, it was for the elite, for the privileged. Mm-hmm. What's the situation in Kuwait?
Everybody must go to school, starting definitely from elementary school, primary school, into intermediate school. So roughly around the ages from 6 to 14, I would say. Kindergarten, typically people go to kindergarten, but it's not a must, and same thing for high school. But generally speaking, it's from ages 6 to 14 years old.
Interesting.
Yep.
I'm also curious about who is responsible for public education. We've heard people refer to it as state-run here already today. And in terms of the Soviet Union, which is where you spend a lot of your scholarly time, who was responsible for public education?
Well, I mean, the Soviet case is a particularly interesting one because when the Bolsheviks come to power in 1917, they proclaim that everybody was going to, boys and girls were going to be receiving free secular education with the emphasis on labor instruction. So in theory, it really was supposed to be for everyone. And this is just the beginning of kind of some fascinating paradoxes within the Soviet system as far as sort of the gap between the proclamations and the reality. And part of it is that the central government is responsible for policies. They get to make this proclamation that is appealing to a lot of people. I mean, there's some debate about the secular part, but the free part is definitely welcomed in Russia for similar reasons that we see Sheena talking about for Korea, that before the revolution it really was something accessible primarily to privileged people, and so when the state says it's going to be there for everybody, it is very much welcomed. The actual implementation, though, ends up being in the hands of local officials, and this is where problems begin because the resources are off. You have the kind of insufficient resources on the ground, making it difficult to actually put that into practice, especially in during the early early phases of the Soviet period. Eventually, by the 30s, 40s, 50s, I mean, compulsory education really is seen as the norm, and boys and girls are all supposed to be in school, and the state actually does try to make sure that parents don't keep their kids out of school, and that they're supposed to be there. And just one last thing, I mean, the Soviet case, it builds on the 19th century European experience, but it adds an extra dimension to it, right? It makes the sort of usefulness to the state part of it much more explicit than perhaps we see in 19th century Europe. The education is free because the state is investing in the children. This is an investment that the state expects to see repaid. So you study not for your own betterment. I mean, if you better yourself, that's wonderful, right? But you don't study necessarily for your own betterment. You study to become a more useful, productive member of society, right? You study so that you can contribute to the building of socialism.
Sue, and you teach German, for those in the audience who don't know, and you teach German culture. Who's responsible for public education in the case of Germany?
And in current Germany now, it's the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, and well, it's actually at one level. Then we have 16 states in Germany, for which we also have a Minister of Education and Research. So while the federal ministry has an annual budget of about 10 billion euros to spend, they mostly spend it on funding research or on funding institutions. However, how educational policy is organized and implemented and funded, that all happens at the state level. So the schools, how they're organized, the curricula, and all those things can be very different across the states in Germany. There's actually a huge difference in performance if you compare schools in the north of Germany with the south. The south generally performs better.
Interesting. And Farah, you teach Arabic here. What's the case like in Kuwait? Who is responsible there?
In Kuwait, there are basically two main ministries that are involved in the Department of Education, and the one is called the Ministry of Education. The other one is the Ministry of Higher Education, and they're in charge of the schools from kindergarten all the way to high school, and including the universities and different. There's University of Kuwait, and there's also small number of universities, private universities, that are also involved over there. So these two ministries are in charge of the education.
Interesting. Sheena?
Korea is very centralized. The education system is very much centralized. It is because historically Korea is a very centralized country, and also it began as a national development project when it became independent. And there is a ministry called, over the time they changed the name in various times. It started as a Ministry of Education, and then later on they added to the Ministry of Education and Science and Technology, and then now it added to the Human Resource Development. So it is probably longest name. So it is a Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and Human Resource Development, and it handles almost the entire education system. Probably some exception is like a military schools, a military academy, which is jointly administered by Ministry of Education, Science, Technology, and Human Resource Development, and also Ministry of Defense, or something like a Coast Guard. I think is American equivalent is like a Coast Guard College of it, and that is jointly administered by all this education administration, and also ministry, and then Ministry of Agriculture and Marine. I don't know exact translation.
The names just roll off the tongue, don't they?
Yeah, it's agriculture and marine products, but.
So we are talking about fairly well-established bureaucracies with a fairly clearly defined purpose. Sometimes a bit more general, for example, in the case of a couple of these where it's education more generally. Sometimes bothering to specify the specifics of what they're doing within education, or where there might be some special emphasis. I'm a little curious, when there is compulsory education, what kind of education is required? And you said that it's about being a better person for purposes of the state, I think that might sort of drive the type of education that one would have received in the former Soviet Union.
Right. Well, certainly in the Soviet Union, I mean, the state obviously has a monopoly. I mean, the state-run education is the only education, the educational system you have. The main differences are going to be in the kind of education you receive, whether it's a more general liberal arts, or what we would consider liberal arts education, or more specialized technical vocational training. And of course, that's something that we see in the Soviet Union was not the only place that had this this system. What I think is so interesting about the Soviet case is that it is ultimately, in most cases, the state that sort of makes that decision. The state feels that, again, education is free, so this is children are the resource of the state. The state wants to make sure that it ends up with a certain number of educated people who are able to continue on to go on to college, and at the same time a certain number of people who are going to be doing manual labor. And so the idea is that there's no point in investing in somebody who's going to be doing manual labor. There's no point in investing them to continue on their education, and in fact, it might actually be counterproductive because they might get ideas and they might decide that they're too good for manual labor, right? So there's the tracking system kind of kicks in where through a variety of different measures, the state wants to make sure that nobody gets kind of an ounce of extra investment that the state doesn't really feel that it that it needs.
Very efficient, as you're always saying.
Well, I mean, it has some flaws, of course, but the idea is efficiency. That in a society with scarce resources, all of which are allocated by the state is going to make the ultimate decisions about people's future and how they're going to be able to achieve them.
So, Farah, in Kuwait, basically you start at, we'd say 6 years old, 5, 6 years old.
Yep.
What are you going to be learning? Is it the same for everybody?
Yes, it's the same for everybody that is in the state of Kuwait. You will have some technical learning, some vocational learning, depending what school you go to. We have liberal arts similar to here, including science. You have to study social sciences. We also have now, Kuwait is a Muslim country. It's a Muslim Arab country that sits on the head of the Arabian Gulf, or the Persian Gulf, as some people call it. And we must learn religion. So in schools, we are taught if you are Muslim, and in the birth certificate it would say if you're Muslim or non-Muslim. So if you are a Muslim person, you must take religion classes over there. So that's a little bit different than America. And you're tested on these classes, and at the end of, and you're basically taking religion classes from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And it's sometimes it's a little hard, of course, because you're tested on it like a regular subject. And what usually happens for students that are not Muslim, Christians, or from a different religion, during that period, they have the option either stay in classroom or they can leave the classroom and go to what it's equivalent of a study hall, I guess, in America. So that, I would say, it's very similar to here, including religion class. You must take religion.
Sheena?
In Korea, education is, well, historically, Korea is a very secular country, so the religion, of course, there is religious schools, but it is not really playing a big part in education. It is mostly about the, just 1 second. What was the question?
What's in the compulsory education? What kind of education are you getting?
It is more about the liberal arts education. Historically, Koreans view education with morality and also refined taste. So that is much emphasized. And during early 70s, the government tried to introduce the technical education to the people, but it was not generally accepted by people, so it is still, until they go into the college, it is a liberal arts education.
Yeah.
Well, I should say that, I mean, maybe I guess I always feel like it's implied, but maybe I should state it explicitly. Of course, as far as content goes, we're not just talking about the different, the emphasis is not just on acquiring a specific set of skills or, a classical liberal education, but of course also an indoctrination, right? Indoctrination plays an extremely important part in the educational system, regardless of which track you're going to be in. And things like morality, I mean, this is what made me think of it, there's the concept of sort of Soviet morality that is also being inculcated. So, love for your country, love for socialism, desire to work really hard, various other patterns of behavior.
Well, I'm kind of curious what the typical day is like for a student, whether you're talking elementary school, middle school, or high school, as we call them here. Sue-Ann, what's the typical day like in Germany for any one of those levels or all of them?
Well, it's very similar for primary school students and secondary school students. We don't really distinguish between middle and high schools, and it's all in one. Elementary schools from grade 1 to 4, and then secondary schools are from grade 5 to 9 or 5 to 13 or 12. They're changing that now too. Well, I think the most interesting fact is probably that all-day schools are not common in Germany. They're thinking of introducing that slowly because of changing realities where, we now have 2 working parents and families. So they're considering debating that right now. However, the normal school day starts around 7:30 or 8, and then it ends around 12 or 12:30. So lunches are not provided in school because students leave before lunch, or if you're in high school and you have afternoon classes, then school's still probably over by 1:30 or 2. There are extracurricular activities that you can do, such as clubs, like we have here. However, they're not very, I don't want to say popular, but not everyone has to be involved in these clubs. So most school children are probably home for lunch.
And I'm sure there are several students right now who just said, wait a minute, I could be done by 12:30. All I have to do is live in Germany.
There's a lot of homework for German high school students.
There's the downside then. Yeah. So, Farah, the typical day, you've already sort of referenced it a little bit in terms of the religion class. What's the rest of the day like?
Well, the classes are, basically it's the same from kindergarten all the way to high school. The 12th grade is the same. And it usually...
Would it be the same building even? Or are we talking...
Depending on the school. Some schools have just kindergarten. Some schools has, like the school I went to, it ran from kindergarten all the way to high school.
Okay.
And so you can stay in one school all your life. I mean, all your school life, I should say. Not all your life.
If you're not doing well, it could be your whole life, I guess, yes.
But usually I would say school runs from like 7:30 in the morning until 2-ish. And then you get to go home. We have all schools, public schools or private school, everybody, all the students must wear uniforms, which makes it easier on the parent, I would say. But everybody has to wear uniforms, and I would say the bell rings around 7:30, 7:35, and then we must do formation. Everybody, all schools across the country, they do formation, morning formation, and in the very beginning, we must say a prayer. Basically, it's the very first chapter of it. We have to say Surah Al-Fatiha, which is the very first chapter of the Quran. It's about 7 verses. And right after that, we say Salam al-Watani, which is basically we repeat a few sentences regarding Kuwait and the Prince. And after that, we follow that with the national anthem. We sing the national anthem, and then we go to our classrooms. We are in groups, and then we go to classrooms. Our classes run between, I would say, 45 minutes. 40 to 45 minutes, I would say, and then we usually have 3 classes and then a break. A recess is only 10 to 15 minutes. Not like here. Here, like you have your lunchtime where you can go and go to the cafeteria and eat. We don't have that. Like recess, you can just grab a snack from the cafeteria and that's it. Because lunch is eaten with your family at the home when you get home, basically around 2:30 or 3 o'clock. And then you have 4 periods after that, and that's basically the end of the day.
Well, I think now there are several students saying they're happy they're not going to school.
Yeah, exactly right. It was fun, I will say that.
But actually the morning time does sound like some private schools, religious schools here, where you start with prayer and the national anthem, or the Pledge of Allegiance and those sorts of things. So it's not, I think people are beginning to understand that they're not that dissimilar. Sheena, I'm sure you've been fascinated by all of this since you teach in the College of Education and Public Policy, but what's a typical day like in Korea for a student?
Well, and at all levels, Korean students spend a longer time in schools. Even in elementary school, they start usually 7:30, but you should come home about 3 o'clock-ish. And just like in Kuwait, we started with a national anthem, but our break time is much longer than Americans. Some schools have even 15 minutes between the class. So students during that time socialize, just go out the playground and play with others. Usually it's 10 minutes, but some schools have longer play hours for purpose. So they come home about 3 o'clock-ish, but then even elementary school students, it doesn't end. They have a dinner and then go to other enrichment programs such as piano, art class, or other sports class, and like that.
And are those part of the education? I mean, you actually go back to your school for your piano class?
No, that is a private part of it.
Okay.
But the formal education ends for elementary school about 3, 4 o'clock. As they go up on a grade, they come home later. But in middle school, it become much more intense, and then finally in high school, some schools they just kept after the dinner time also. It's not formal, but they kept their students and prepare for their college entrance exam. And I heard that when I was in Korea last time, some schools kept their children until 9, 10 o'clock-ish.
Well, certainly people are saying, I'm glad I don't go there. But let's talk about college and post-secondary or college, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, that life is very different for students in the United States. We've all seen it. The students who come here their first year, they think that we take attendance and that we're going to yell at them if they don't come to class. And then they start finding out, we don't really care. You're an adult. Do what you want to do. Okay, some of us care. We care, but we're not going to take attendance on you. What is that post-secondary experience like? Let's actually start with Sue-Wen on this one.
Having attended a German university and also having gone to graduate school here, it's very different in my opinion. The German university system, and now it's changing too, but it used to be not as structured. Students have to choose their own major, and they basically have to decide what they're going to be or what they are going to study by 12th or 13th grade. So you pick your major, you enter your university, and then from the very first semester, you're taking courses relevant to your major. So there are usually not classes like here students take general education classes. None of that. It's just assumed that you have learned these things and covered these things already in high school or in prep school, because I'll talk about the different types of secondary school a little bit later. But yeah, those things are already expected, so you start right into your major, and it's counted in semesters rather than years. Here, if you're entering in 2011, you'll be graduating in 2015. You have your own class. However, in Germany, you start, and it takes however long it takes you to study. I think the average college time could be anywhere from 4 to 10 years sometimes. Sometimes it takes people a little bit longer. Yeah.
Now, we know part of the reason students take a little longer here occasionally is that they're going part-time, or they may change their major several times. What would get somebody up to that 10-year limit?
Probably very similar reasons. Even though Germany is a country that doesn't charge tuition as much as American universities do here, we now, for the last few years, we now have some states in Germany charge tuition. It doesn't really generally go over 500 euros a semester, or 1,000 euros a semester. And even when that was introduced, thousands of German students went on the streets and were protesting the introduction of tuition. So it could be many reasons. It could be that they're working part-time or full-time sometimes. Sometimes they just want to take their time. Some of them see it as enrichment. They want to take as many classes as possible. Sometimes it's maybe a lack of having a good advisor who kind of guides you through the system. Could be many, many reasons.
Sheena, you've already made the Korean system sound much more rigorous. What's it like when you make that step from K through 12, as we would call it here, to the post-secondary world?
In the past, Korean university students did not really study because in the high school times they spend such a rigorous time spending in college entrance examination for preparation of it. But in recent visit, I was very surprised. They are really studying because they have to get a job, and then most of elite companies, they require a competitive exam. And in addition to that, in order to get the competitive edge, they are getting another certificate, such as accounting, or most of favorite one is English, because most of companies that they want to expand to international area, they require English. So they are really studying. Their studying did not end by entering into college like it was in the past. So.
Well, I'd say that's probably a good thing, though, actually. Right? Now, for some educational systems, they'll actually try to help you decide, maybe even decide for you what track you should be in. and that decision gets made at a variety of different stages. So I'm kind of curious whether that happens in the countries we're talking about today, and if so, how it happens, when it happens. Let's actually start with Kuwait this time. Do people get told you're going to be a meat cutter, as I was told when I was in 8th grade?
Well, when you get to 10th grade, depending on your grades, now you have to take chemistry, biology, you take science classes, and you take also literature classes. When you get to 10th grade, you have to make the decision what you will be, what track you will basically take, whether it's the literature track or the science track for 11th and 12th grade, and that will determine where you're going to go to college and what major you will have basically when you get into college. If you basically sit with a counselor, or the advisor, I should say, and your parents and your teachers, your favorite teachers, I would say, the ones that you trust, and they can give you good advice, and they kind of sit with you and say, okay, your grades are higher in science fields, your grades are higher in the literature field, so we advise you to take this track, and mostly students kind of take with that advice. They say, okay, I'm going to the science track, I'm going to go to the literature track. The advantage of the science track, and that's why parents want their children to take the science track, is if you want to switch, when you get to college and you want to switch to the literature track, you can. If you go to the literature track, you cannot be a doctor, for example, an MD for what I'm trying to say. So you're a little bit more limited with the literature track. And that kind of goes along with different Arab countries too, and sometimes it's a little bit more complicated in different Arab countries. So that kind of so basically, when you're 10th grade, your performance of 10th grade determines what you will be or what track you will be in college.
And I take it when you get into 11th and 12th grade, if your performance is really good, then there are sort of specializations within that area. If it's kind of poor, then you're going to be aiming a little bit lower.
And it's harder to get accepted into universities because we go with percentages, and now in Kuwait some schools are going with the GPA, like the points grade, like your grade point average. With the percentage, if you score, I would say probably nowadays, probably 85 and less, it's very tough to get accepted into universities, not just in Kuwait, even in the Arab world. And but if you have an 85 or up, especially 90 and up percentage, then it's easier to get into colleges and universities that you want than the other students.
Suin, what's the German case like?
In Germany, so elementary school, as I mentioned before, ends at 4th grade. And we have 5 types of secondary schools in Germany. Gymnasium, which is not to be mistaken for gymnasium here. It's basically, we should probably see it as a college prep school. Then there's Realschule, which is kind of a medium secondary school, and then Hauptschule for weaker students, and then we have a Sonderschule, which is for special needs students, and then a comprehensive school, the Gesamtschule. So already the grades in your 3rd and 4th grade basically determine which school you will attend after 4th grade. The teacher, your class teacher will basically recommend, based on your grades, where you should go. However, this has a huge impact on your later life because only graduates from the prep school, the gymnasium, are actually allowed to go on to college. So if you're going to either Realschule or Hauptschule, you can still go to university. However, you have to do a different route, take evening courses, maybe something similar to GED courses, which takes more time, is more labor intensive and all that. So
can you move from one to the other while you're going through?
Yes, you can. It's more difficult to move up, of course, than to move down. There are exploratory grades, 5th and 6th grade where students have the opportunity to move up or down. However, it happens more often that students from gymnasium move down rather than the other way around. So it's interesting with the tracks that we have because Germany, not many students end up studying at the university. Here, I think more than, or about 60% of high school graduates actually end up studying at the university. This number is a lot lower in Germany. Actually, if you are a college graduate, you're called an Akademiker. Here it sounds like academic. However, it's not the same. People with a college degree are very respected, but that's also because there are not many who actually graduate from college, even though the number of overall college students has risen over the years. So yeah, basically already in 3rd and 4th grade, your life could be decided based on your grades.
Out of curiosity, of those different levels, are they the same building? Are they the same campus?
They're different schools. They're completely different schools.
Different.
Yeah. So the students who graduate from the other two secondary schools usually end up going on to vocational schools. For example, if you want to become a bank teller in Germany, here you can just pick up an application, start at a bank right away. However, most professions in Germany are tied to a degree from a vocational school. So for becoming a bank teller, you would have to go to vocational school that includes theory and practice, and it's a 3-year education process. And that's true for anything, even if you want to become a florist, a baker, a butcher, anything usually entails going to school and working for 3 years.
I'm kind of curious, in terms of Kuwait, are they the same campus? You said you could go to
Yes.
the lit, okay.
Yep, in the same high school.
Okay.
Yep.
Anybody have further comments on tracking? This is, I mean, it's one of those things that, even though here in the States there's sort of no official tracking, it does happen, we know. Anyone else? Sheena, Anne?
Korea does not tracking. As I said earlier, they favor the liberal arts education. And many people aspire for going to college, so they tend to do that. But those students who are not scoring really high, they can elect a vocational track in secondary schools, but that is not really favored by many people.
In terms of the Soviet Union, did this sort of limit your potential? I mean, if you're supposed to be the best you can be, does tracking have a tendency to limit someone's potential? I mean, is that, I don't want to say it's at the stated purpose, but...
Well, I mean, the Soviet system would never have called it tracking because it's such a bourgeois concept of, deciding people's potential so early on. I mean, in practice, it ends up being that way. But I mean, the idea is that the regime, that people can contribute to the building of socialism in a variety of different ways, right? That you can be a professor, you can be a literary scholar, an engineer, or a manual laborer. All labor is equally valuable. In practice, I mean, and then this is the difference sort of between propaganda and reality. The reality was very different. The perception was that, I mean, interestingly enough, some of the manual labor was actually not that badly paid, in part to try to compensate for some of the other things. But there was a perception of kind of an easier life versus a more difficult life, and so the. Part of the issue was, who gets to make that decision, right? The correlation between educational opportunities and social class, and so and parents' wealth. And I think that it's a. When we frame, oftentimes when we look at something like tracking, we think of it in terms of educational ability, right? Well, of course, I mean, why should a kid who has no chance of ever being able to go to college, why not put them on a path that will allow them to get a job and get on with their life? But there are also interesting things kind of correlating with, with wealth and social class that raise kind of problems about this. I mean, to what extent does this perpetuate, right, kind of social categories and privilege, and to what extent is it truly kind of a reflection of merit? And it may seem like something that doesn't quite apply to the Soviet case, but even there we see parents trying to make sure that their kids don't end up getting into certain tracks because they would like to see their children kind of have a more prestigious life, even if they're not necessarily mentally equipped for it. The way somebody else would be.
In the case of Kuwait, is there a real differentiation, or is it just, hey, you have a different skill set?
It's just different skill set. It's not negative at all. It's and we like. Both tracks can go to colleges because one is just literature, or it could be a teacher, could be a writer, whatever that track basically takes you to. The science one is just basically the science field. That's the only difference. But they both have the same opportunities in two different fields, I would say. I just don't look at it as a negative thing. I look at it as a guidance. It kind of tells you, okay, this is where you're good at, and for us to enhance your skills, or for you to enhance your skills, this is what you're good at. Try this track. Instead of, like, for example, when I started college here in America, I was kind of overwhelmed. There's so many things to choose from. This makes it a little easier to choose from instead of getting so overwhelmed and changing your major all the time. I think it's just...
Are we up to now average of 5 changes, right, for students, or is it 7, something like that?
Something like that. A lot of changes. I think 7, actually. But I think it just gives the students the opportunity to excel the best at what they know the best, or what we believe they know the best, or capable of.
So we hear people talk about test scores a lot. how good are your test scores. People are making decisions about what schools to send their kids to, what districts to live in here in the United States based on test scores. How do we measure progress in other countries? And Anne, let's start with you.
Well, I mean, ironically, actually, standardized tests are a relatively late arrival to Russia, and something that is seen as very much a Western import, and not a very good one.
You think they would have taken that on a little earlier?
Well, you would think, but I mean, there are some standardized tests, but they're not, the multiple choice. I mean, at the end of the year, you write these essays, and they're being evaluated to make sure that that students are making appropriate progress. But you don't have the same kind of. There are these standardized tests. Schools have to take them, and that is how a school's progress is measured. A school's quality is measured in the kinds of classes it offers and where its graduates go on, rather than how well it does on these standardized tests. And this is actually kind of a huge change in Russia right now, because it's seen as something that was brought in from the West, and not just the United States, of course, but from Europe as well, kind of part of the different standardization in the European Union. And there's a tremendous amount of unhappiness over it, because it is seen as destroying what's uniquely Russian about education, but also kind of really serious concerns raised about some things are simply not measurable in these kind of standardized test settings. The interesting thing is, of course, that these are some of the same concerns that people raise in the United States and other countries as well. But apparently, in the last couple of years, there were protests and demonstrations. I mean, I don't get too excited, not Egypt circa 2011 kind of protests, but kind of general unhappiness about the fact that this is ruining, that this is in fact ruining education. That people are now studying for the test instead of studying for the pursuit of knowledge.
Amazing. I've heard that sort of expression elsewhere.
It sounds familiar, doesn't it?
It's crazy. So Germany, by 3rd or 4th grade, you know where you're going. How do we know where you're going? I mean, are these test scores you're talking about standardized test scores?
No, actually the concept of standardized test is actually very foreign to Germans, just like in Russia. And so it wasn't Germany that introduced it to Russia, obviously. Very similar progress is probably measured by final exam or exit exam papers before students go on to the university. They're probably compared among the performance in other schools in other states. Just recently, maybe you've heard of the PISA study, which was commissioned by the UN, was started in 2000, turned out to be a very controversial study in Germany, because Germany didn't perform as well as Germany thought it would. It was kind of in the middle range. And so what they tested was literacy in 2000, and so they test different areas every 3 years, also science and math. And countries such as South Korea, I read, did really, really well. Germany, however, did not do as well as I said. The difficulty or the criticism of the PISA study was probably by Germans that German students are not used to answering multiple choice tests. And while questions were also in essay form in that survey, many of the questions were asked in a multiple choice test form. And also students that are surveyed are all students who are 15 years old. However, it's not by grade. So you could have a 15-year-old who is in 9th grade, or someone who's in 10th grade. So. And then also we have the 5 different types of secondary schools in Germany, where the levels are extremely different. Can you really compare their education? Is this fair to compare? And of course, students at the gymnasium did well. However, students at the Hauptschule, their performance was lacking. And so it's really difficult. And I think that's why Germans have been struggling with this study, and they actually call it the PISA shock studie, the PISA shock study. So it's the progress is measured in different ways, but they did take something out of it in that they have now made recommendations as to strengthen programs that are available for migrant children. For example, in Germany, Germany has a large migrant population, so there are efforts taken now that came out of this study. So there are good things about it, but I think people are aware that they have to take the results of the study with a grain of salt.
Sheena, she mentioned South Korea doing particularly well on standardized tests. What is the situation with standardized tests?
In Korea, I believe that the competitiveness, comparative exam is in the fabric. History goes back to 1,000 years when other countries just appoint the government official as close to kings and queens and all that. Koreans selected these government officials through competitive exams, so it has a really long history. And they just wanted to. The idea was selecting the best competent people. And as modern education introduced, there was still more demand than supply of the educational opportunity. So each level, they have to take an exam to advance. So if you just have a test high, you can go to more elite schools, and you're going into elite university and get a good job. And if you are not tested well, you go to the less elite school or not even advanced at all. So it is a really much in Koreans' fabric. However, there is a little concern about this exam recently, in spite of these high scores in international standardized test, because it just encourages competitiveness, which in may be a good. However, there is other virtues such as citizenship and other things, and this comparative exam causes much of a damage to physical, mental of growing children. So there is a real demand just to think about alternative way to measuring student progress rather than through this competitive exam. So I think it is interesting that Americans are really looking at the South Korea, Japan, and those countries as a model of academic achievement, academic competitiveness, while those countries are looking at other ways.
It's interesting because when you start talking about standardized tests, you potentially change what you focus on in terms of education. You had earlier mentioned teaching morals and citizenship and those sorts of things, and we don't usually see that on a standardized test. Are we talking about standardized tests in Kuwait?
We do have standardized tests. Especially I would say the most important one is your senior year, what you call senior year here, which is your 12th grade. At the end of your 12th grade, you have to actually, every single 12th grader in the country takes the test at the same time, exactly the same test, and that kind of determines what your future is on your cumulative grades after taking all the subjects, exams. And if you score a certain percentage, a high percentage, then you will kind of be guaranteed you're going to have a great life at college. You're going to pick the college that you want, and you're going to get accepted. If you do poorly, then very slim chances that you will even get into college.
But can you have a bad GPA and a good test score?
No.
No?
No.
Okay.
No. Well, that test score it's a big percentage of your GPA or your percent or your. Okay. Do you see what I mean? Yeah. It's not a small portion of your final grade. It's a big portion of your final grade, and they do take they do count the other exams that you've taken and your progress throughout the year or the year. Sometimes they basically account from your freshman year all the way to your senior year. They keep track of all your grades and they accumulate that to your final grade at the end of your senior year. But the final exam is the most important, and usually students are very nervous, and it's a big, huge celebration when you pass, and especially when you get a very high percentage.
What sort of insider conclusions do you draw about governments, culture, and societies more generally based on your understanding of the public education system in that particular country? And we'll actually start with Anne and run around this way. So Anne, you're first.
Well, I think that one of the big things, and this is why, at least for my answers, I kept putting the emphasis on the public education, because obviously there, especially today, there are a variety of other educational opportunities open in many countries. The emphasis on public education, I mean, in many ways, the way that government chooses to approach public education, the way that it chooses to fund public education, is a huge reflection of our priorities as a society. And this is why, I mean, certainly as somebody who's a specialist in the study of the Soviet Union, looking specifically at how to understand the Soviet system through the prism of the educational system, looking at kind of contemporary discussions about education in the United States, sort of raise some very disturbing and very important questions, right? To what extent, what are going to be the consequences of the fact that we are kind of very consistently taking money out of public education and putting it into other areas? And because we have a brief stab at this, the one name I want to mention is Diane Ravitch. She was somebody who in the 70s and 80s was a huge proponent of school reform, with particular emphasis on alternatives to public education, charter schools, private schools, and so on. And in recent years, she has completely changed her position on the subject, in part because she started studying education systems in other countries, and in particular in Pakistan, where she saw what happens when the government does not invest in a public education system, and the very dramatic and negative consequences of that. And it seems that for her, she wants to emphasize now the connection between public schools and the cultivation of democracy and democratic citizens. And so hopefully one of the things that we can walk away from this is just kind of thinking about this much more carefully, especially in our contemporary discussions about the fate of our educational system.
Mm-hmm. Sarah?
Well, in my opinion, I'll say that education, of course, is, as Sheena mentioned before, it improves the quality of life, and I think that's the big goal out of it. It enhances your interpersonal relationships. It teaches you how to basically live your life after school, your work life, your daily life, how to be a good citizen or resident in that society. And of course, how to be more productive, but it also raises the level of the country's status too, as well.
Sorry?
Well, having gone to school in Germany and studied in both countries, Germany and the United States, I can certainly see advantages and disadvantages in both systems, and I think that's what will go away from this table, that we realize there are good and bad things about every school system. There's no educational system that's perfect in the world, or at least I yet have to find this system. And I think the good question here, and Anne already raised that, is if we're looking at this country, with all the testing that's going on, and what are we doing with the information? How is it used? Is it worthwhile to look at other countries to see how they're doing? Yes, definitely. I would say we definitely need to look at other countries. One maybe little tiny thing that I would like to mention is that I think most countries have the requirement for children to be educated. In Germany in particular, they have the requirement to go to school, to attend school. And of course, this is something that Hitler had actually introduced, because he wanted students to be to follow the Nazi ideology, but that was a leftover, and now homeschooling, for example, in Germany is not allowed. It's illegal. And just in 2010, a German family has been granted asylum in the United States because they wanted to homeschool their children. So this is just a side, but I thought I would still mention it.
It's an interesting one. It's a very interesting one. Sheena?
I think we all agree that the education is an integral part of every modern society, and it just reflects the country's past and present. But not only that, it just imagines the future. So in that way, education is a collective or social investment of each country. And often on the educational debate goes on to academic achievement of a student. So in that sense, going back to national collective imagination, I think we have to think more about more education in different direction, about the quality of life, happiness, and equity, and all that kind of things. And so often on the educational reform issues are just decided by policymakers in United States. So it is a very positive things that I think we should have a more public debate on direction of education and what kind of country that they are imagining. And so it involves the more of a public and specialist, rather than decided by policymakers who just have to deal with immediate issues.
Well, I want to thank all of you for participating today. We have, starting on the left, Sheena Choi from the College of Education and Public Policy, from the Department of International Language and Culture Studies, Sue Ann Roberts, also from ILCS, Farah Combs, and finally from the Department of History, Ann Livshiz. Thank you very much for joining us. This is one of several programs that we're doing on domestic issues, whether that would be military involvement, education, taxes, welfare, etc. You can see these on MDON. You can also look for them on CATV. Thank you to them for recording this. And this was brought to you by the Departments of History and Political Science, as well as the American Democracy Project here at IPFW. Thank you.